Quite some time ago, I made a video discussing why I think that Twin Trouble is an underrated episode that quite frankly deserved more love. Since then, I've been pondering over some other episodes that I don't think get enough credit, one of which being the subject of today's video, Season 5's Make Someone Happy. I have a list of several other Thomas episodes that I'd like to talk about, so if you enjoy this video and want to see more like it, then be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and ring Toby's bell to stay notified for when I post new content. Now with all of that out of the way, let's get started. So the plot is as follows. It's summertime on Sodor, and everyone is enjoying the holiday vibes. Everyone, except for James, that is. The big red engine is being his usual, grumpy, vain self, complaining about not being given a more glamorous job. You know, the usual shtick. This annoys Thomas, who straight up tells James to pull his head out of his ass and try thinking about someone other than himself for once. James, being James, obviously ignores this and leaves. Meanwhile, there's a side plot with Percy and Oliver involving a fun fair. This will be more significant later. As the day goes by, James's mood only continues to get worse, until he runs into Mrs. Kindly. Turns out she's really upset, as her sister who was supposed to be visiting is now unable to. The Fat Controller soon hears about this, and remembering how much of a good friend that Mrs. Kindly is to the railway, organises a special surprise to cheer her up, involving a ride with Harold and a surprise tour with James, which ends with them arriving at the fair and she even gets to make the opening announcement. The episode ends as Thomas and James watch the fun rides and the latter admits that the blue tank engine was right about putting someone else first. Honestly, I always really liked this episode. Slice of life stories are some of my favourite types of narrative in this franchise. Remember, that's what the entire series started with, and so it's nice to have something that is so simple and sweet in the midst of all the excitement of Season 5. But that's not the only reason as to why I like it, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the story. So the main point of interest, and the one that gets talked about the most by fans, is the opening conversation with Thomas and James. Almost everyone loves when these two are paired up, and why wouldn't you? In their truest forms, they're very similar to each other. Both are egotistical hotheads that often let their naivety get the better of them. But despite that, both are still very capable engines who can step up to the plate when push comes to shove. What this episode does, and to be fair Season 5 as a whole, is contrast that with how it portrays Thomas. As we all know by this point, Thomas had quite the character arc over the first 5 seasons, where he slowly and gradually matured over time, even becoming his goated version in Season 5. Out of all the examples of Thomas's maturity that Season 5 has to offer, I think that this single line of dialogue is the best example of that.
James, why don't you think about something or someone else for a change? You'll be surprised at how much better you'll feel if you do.
That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
There are many other great examples of this, of course. However, this line speaks volumes, because Thomas likely sees a previous version of himself in James. Thomas almost always only ever thought of himself back in the day, and now he's the one to tell off one of the snooty big engines. It's little moments like this that easily cement Thomas as one of my top 5 favourite characters in the series. And I'm quite frankly surprised that few people even have him in their favourites list at all, never mind their top 5. Thomas isn't the only standout character though. My boy James is a notable highlight for me as well. James's arc in this episode is rather wonderful. Most of James's character arcs simply involve him learning to not be such a self-centered hothead. And while that is the case here, it's the subtlety and the specific characters that do it for me. I've already mentioned Thomas, but I love that they used Mrs. Kindly instead of another engine. I think that using a human character adds a lot of an impact, especially when we see them crying. Up until this point, we'd only ever seen the engines get this upset, but seeing it with a fellow human character makes for a more sympathetic and empathetic experience. I also think that it's beautiful that they chose to use Mrs. Kindly of all people. Season 5 really made her feel like a part of Sodor's community, and not just a random old lady that lived on Thomas's branch line. This is especially true if you watch the UK dub, as the narrator specifically refers to her as James's friend.
Then he saw his friend, Mrs. Kindly.
Speaking of which, I love the continuity in this scene. If you look closely, you can see that she pulls up at Farquhar Station. This is that yard that we see in Thomas Goes Fishing. It wouldn't have been too drastic if we had seen her at, say, Knapford, but I always really appreciated when the show creators made sure to stick to already established lore. This scene is also noteworthy for 2 reasons. The first is that despite James's foul mood, he's the first one to notice that Mrs. Kindly is upset.
She looks miserable.
Then when Harold takes Kitty, yes, that's her actual first name, into the sky, James does complain about getting dirty again.
Harold's made my red paint dustier than ever.
But we also hear this.
But he was happy for Mrs. Kindly.
It's subtle, but this single moment, combined with his observation when he arrived at the yard, are a nice indication that James does in fact care and has a kinder, softer side buried beneath his ego. This is probably the best example of it that we've seen since his original trilogy back in Season 1. James and Thomas aren't the only noteworthy characters in this though. I also want to mention the Fat Controller. Season 5 really humanised Topham. The episode Lady Hat's Birthday Party is the most obvious example, but there are other standout moments as well, such as when he becomes worried and joins Harold in the search for Oliver in Oliver's Find. But also this episode, where his first instinct is to organise a special treat for Mrs. Kindly. Not only does it show us just how much she means to the community, but it's a perfect example of Topham's good heart. Evil fascist dictator my ass. And of course, there's the ending. It's a really sweet moment where James admits on his own terms that Thomas was right.
You were quite right, Thomas, James whispered. Making someone happy does cheer you up.
Which is made all the more special when Thomas doesn't rub it in his face and simply smiles. Overall, Make Someone Happy is a really heartwarming and sweet episode that makes excellent use of not only its 2 primary characters, but it also makes great complementary use of its secondary ones. Prior to writing this script, I asked you guys what you all thought of this episode, and a lot of you seemed to share my thoughts on it, so I've highlighted a couple comments that stood out to me. I apologise if yours doesn't appear in this video, these are just the ones that stood out to me. Flying Dorito says it's a beautiful story, and one of the best looking episodes of the era. James is perfectly in character for the episode, and Thomas is an amazing reflection of his state of maturity at this stage of the series. I honestly couldn't agree more. Thomas and James usually bring out the worst in each other, but this time, they actually bring out the best in each other. Daniel Boone 3770 says, I love it because of the scene where Thomas tells James he shouldn't be selfish and think of others for a change. It's a change from being that troublesome pest back in Season 1. Yep, sure is. And finally, Sodor Railway Studios 2006 said, it's a pretty good episode in my opinion, and I love seeing James go through that arc he received. Nice message in there as well. Definitely a nice break from the Season 5's adrenaline rush. Personally, I find Season 5 to be kind of overrated, but it's still a great season, and this episode is one of its hidden gems. Well said. I can understand why this one might not stand out to some people, but to say it's only things that just happen on Sodor really doesn't do it justice. And that's going to do it for today, folks. I hope you all enjoyed me talking about another one of Thomas's episodes that I believe deserves more love. What do you think of Make Someone Happy? Are there any points that I missed? Did you find a new appreciation for it? Please let me know your perspectives, as I always love hearing the insight that you all have. I'm planning on doing some more videos like this for some other episodes in the future, so stay tuned. Now until next time, I've been Cinders and Ashes UK, you've been awesome, and have a great day. Bye!